Hello, everybody. Orbax here from the Department of Physics at the University of Guelph, and I'd like to welcome you to the first in our streaming series. We're taking an effort here at the University of Guelph Department of Physics to reach out to our students in this strange and unusual time and to give you some interaction with some of our faculty and professors and just an opportunity to chat about physics and to have some live one-on-one interaction. So tonight is going to be the first attempt at doing that, and fingers crossed that everything will work out the best way it absolutely, I'm sure, should. We've got a great team with us here behind the scenes. Saksham Sharma is running the boards in the background. You can't see him. Our friend Mel from Tips and Tricks with Mel is also in the wings and standby. She may join us live on satellite at some point during this broadcast. But tonight, we're very lucky to have with us a very well in the Department of Physics at the University of Guelph. He is the director of the Nanoscience program, amongst many other accolades, which I'm sure we'll get into. Welcome for the stream ever, Dr. John Dutcher. Let's welcome him in, everybody. Give him, I guess, a round of applause at home. Welcome, John. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing just fine. How about yourself?
Well, it's been an interesting and unusual semester, so I'm glad that you could join us with this, and we can actually get an opportunity to talk to some of our undergrads and maybe even some alumni out there watching these videos and still get a chance to sort of chat physics and talk about what's interesting.
Yeah, well, I think this is a really great effort, and I really commend you for setting this up, and I hope we'll...
You know, I wouldn't call myself a hero, but it's nice to hear you say that.
Did I say hero? I can't remember.
Well, you just did now, so I'm taking that as a quote. But so I guess let's just get right into it. You've been here at the University of Guelph now for quite some time, since 1990, when you arrived here as an assistant prof and then made it to associate and then full professor within a pretty rapid succession of time. But how did you start in physics? What kind of got you interested in physics, and what brought you to Guelph?
That's a great question. When I was in high school, I grew up in Moncton, New Brunswick, and there was the opportunity to take some science courses in high school, and I seemed to like everything, and so I had a problem. I didn't know what I wanted to study. At one point, I even wanted to be a lawyer for some reason.
We're lucky that didn't happen.
But I kind of gravitated to the more technical side. I liked one of my physics teachers, and so a friend of mine and myself decided that we would try to take a really challenging program at Dalhousie University called Engineering Physics. So I couldn't really decide whether I liked physics better or engineering better. And so I decided to take one of these joint programs, which, is not so different from the approach we take in the nanoscience program here at Guelph, right? It's for people who have many different interests and want to try to figure out what they like the most. And so I started off in engineering physics, and then by second year, it became clear to me that I liked physics a lot more than engineering. I was interested in understanding, how things worked, right? Not making things work, but understanding how the world works. That's really what physics is, to me anyway. And so it became clear. It was actually one textbook I can remember, Edward Purcell's book on electricity and magnetism. Look it up, kids.
We'll put links in the show notes to it.
It's a great book, though, and it was very inspiring, I thought, actually. And that was really what grabbed me. And, when you're a student looking for what you want to do with the rest of your life, you want to be grabbed by something.
It's interesting because, you hear when we ask a lot of people about why they got into physics, you often do hear that resounding sentiment of they always want to know how things worked or why things work. And it's like you said with engineering, not the making things work. But I don't think I've ever heard anybody who said that they were actually grabbed by E&M in second year. I think for a lot of us, E&M in second year is a little bit of a struggle to get through. So that's kind of a fascinating idea, especially considering what you continued on in later, that E&M was what really grabbed you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was just a sponge. I was looking for understanding everything I could, right? And this particular book was an approach, more so than the subject matter, but an approach that really grabbed me, actually.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's exciting. And so then you continued on to graduate from there.
Yes.
And so you become a graduate at Dalhousie, and then you decide to literally go entirely across the country to do your master's.
Yes. Yeah. This is all, it all happens almost by, happenstance, really, how one's career gets laid out. I had a summer job at the National Research Council in Ottawa after fourth year, and there was a new staff member there that had just come from UBC and was studying, he did his PhD in battery physics. And I'm like, oh, that sounds kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So
well, again, that's maybe perhaps one of those things where it's to an inquisitive, somebody who's interested in like an engineering side as well. It's like, well, how does a battery actually work, and how do you actually make that? I think I speak for a lot of people that when you do your undergrad, by the end of your 4 years, you have all this math that you can do, and you have all these equations you can solve, but you still might not actually know how a lot of very simple things that we use every day actually work.
Yes, that's true. Unfortunately, that's true. Yes. So I thought I would try that. And so I went to UBC and did my master's degree in what are called lithium intercalation batteries, the things that run your iPhone now. And then I decided maybe battery physics wasn't really what I was interested in. And I looked around for something else to do, and I ended up doing my PhD at Simon Fraser, which is also in the Vancouver area. So I got to stay in Lotus Land and enjoy that wonderful environment there for some more years.
Well, at least you got a little bit. I guess you weren't. You were still used to the rain, whether it was on the East Coast or the West Coast. It didn't really matter so much. The winters are a little less harsh, though, as far as I know.
Yeah, it's a pretty special place to live, I would say.
So you go from battery physics to getting into condensed matter. How does that transition take place?
Yeah, well, when I finished my master's degree, I was looking around for something interesting to do, and believe it or not, I couldn't find anything, to use the same word, that grabbed me at UBC. It was only when I went to Simon Fraser that I found a project that was, I thought, pretty cool. It was the start of an effort in making very, very thin, perfect films on perfect surfaces. So my whole PhD project was on 3 monolayers of iron. Right? So growing an iron film that's only 3 atoms thick. So you have to do that pretty carefully, obviously.
Yeah, you only had a margin of error by 1 or 2 atoms at that point.
That's right. So it was a completely different kind of physics, but something that I really enjoyed. And I built this fancy light scattering spectrometer that allowed me to study these special films, and discovered something new, and it went from there.
That's pretty exciting. I think, when I think back to where I went from my undergraduate to my master's to when I started my PhD, it's funny when you get far enough away from it, it all kind of makes sense in your personal history, as it was a flow of stuff that got you to a certain point. But at the time, I think it's easy to forget that at the time you just are kind of looking for interesting things to work in and fields to sort of dive into. And I think a lot of our undergrads probably get stuck with an interesting dilemma as they approach the end of their undergraduate work, and it's what do they want to do? So it's exciting for them to hear, I think, that you can still change the topics that you're interested in and the things that you study. You're just still doing physics.
Yep. Well, really, I mean, I've been changing topics all the way through my career.
Well, I was going to say, if there's probably a word that sums up your career that I would assign to it, it would be innovation. You're constantly moving from one field into a different field, and just finding new and interesting things in each one.
Mm-hmm. Well, the beauty of science really is all about learning, and to continue to learn new things is really what we should all strive for, I think. And so I've been very fortunate in my career to start off with physics, but then add to it aspects of chemistry and biology and engineering and so on, and even business, and to learn continually during that whole time is just a real gift, I would say. To be
And
able
so
to do that.
would you find that kind of thing daunting, or is it just the excitement of a new topic to try to get in and learn all the nitty-gritty about how it all works?
It can be daunting, but I mean, you have to have a good approach to it. You don't start doing something different without having any background in it. The easiest way to ease into a new field is to work with somebody in that field and to learn from them and from the people who work with them. And then gradually you become proficient and maybe even an expert in that new field, which is pretty cool. But yeah, it can be daunting. It's not for everyone, I would say. But if you are adventurous.
Well, but it's an interesting point to see this idea that sometimes that even as you get older, I mean, you're much, much older than I am. But like even as we get older, that you can still seek shepherds or people to learn from or to mentor you through these new fields, and to just be open to the fact that they might know something that you don't.
Yes. Yeah, I've been very fortunate to work with people who are very welcoming into their field and very willing to work with somebody from a different field. And that's really been quite beautiful.
Yeah, and I think that's the exciting thing, right? Is that when you're looking at something, and I guess we should really get into what the work that's been the majority of your career, which is going then from your thin monolayers of iron into looking at soft condensed matter and looking at polymers, and the thin surface adhesion there. But looking at this idea that I just totally lost my train of thought, and that's completely live, so I can't even edit this out.
Just keep going, Norvax.
I know I can usually just keep talking and talk myself out. But so you're getting to soft matter, and you're trying. I'm completely okay. We'll use this as an edit point, and we'll cut back in, and we're live. Well, welcome to our first live stream ever. We're here tonight. No, the idea was that often I think people are excited to work with new groups and people in other disciplines, and especially the opportunity to work with a physicist in something like biology or in chemistry or something like soft materials really seemed to be an entry point into opening into these new fields. And so when you got into soft matter, I think it was a similar purpose, right?
Yeah. Soft matter became interesting to me actually when I was a postdoc down in Arizona. We had a visitor who was a director of the Max Planck Institute for Polymer Research in Germany. And he was making these little polymer films, which we would then measure. And it's like, oh, this is pretty cool. And then you start to read about, not only the applications of something like that, but also the fundamental science behind it. And once again, it turns out to be very interesting. And when I came to Guelph, I decided that polymer films would be a really great thing to focus on.
So what brings you to Guelph? Are you sort of scouted by the university to come and be a new prof? Were they looking to do work in soft matter? Had they been doing work already in that field?
Yeah, the whole idea behind getting an academic job is an interesting premise, right?
It seems to be a varied and different story for every single person I've talked to about the subject.
At the time, there were not a lot of academic jobs in physics in Canada. We have sort of this model in Canada. All the universities started in the mid-'60s, and they hired all these people who then worked through their careers and then retired, right? And then they hired a bunch more. And so there are these boom and bust periods. And so I was in a bit of a bust period, I guess, where there really weren't too many positions. And so I thought, well, I'll throw my hat in the ring and go to a practice interview at the University of Guelph. Right. Yeah. So in that case, there was a good match between what I was looking for and what they were looking for. And it's really important. You not only have to be very good, I would say, but there also has to be a match between a person and a department. And so that's the really tricky part to nail down, to try to make scientific, because it's
Yeah,
inherently non-scientific.
of finding, just getting lucky enough to stumble into the right place, right time, and having that come along at the right time in your career.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, so much of what we do is based on luck and happenstance, I would say, right? But you have to be prepared for that, right?
Mm-hmm. Well,
You,
and so you start here as an assistant prof, um, working through some of your stuff. Do you get grad students at a point in time like this? I think a lot of undergrads and a lot of our listeners probably are just curious about how this whole process works and worked back then. So this was back before the internet in the early 40s. Is that correct? But this would have been right around what, 1990?
1990, yeah.
So, I mean, we in all honesty, you don't have active email at this point, do we? We don't have the web as we see it now. How do you come into a completely different city, set up a lab, get students? How does any of that work back then?
Yeah, well, you just put your head down and work pretty hard to get
Right.
going, right? And I was fortunate enough to get a couple of grad students right away, and that's great to have hands in the lab, and because we were building a very fancy light scattering spectrometer from scratch, and so that whole process was a good learning experience both for them and for me, and it actually led us to produce this instrument that turned out to be very important for our first big home run in polymer films, actually. We had an instrument that not many people had access to, and were able to do some experiments that really nobody else had thought of doing. And so
would this be an ellipsometer? Is that what that would have been at the time, or?
it was something called a Brillouin light scattering spectrometer.
Okay.
Yes.
And so you're scattering light through thin polymer films. And
Mm-hmm.
what are you discovering at the time? What's the actual study that's taking place, and what are you seeing?
Well, what we were doing, so the basic idea was based on some original work at the University of Cambridge, where they made a thin polymer film and down on a substrate. So it had one surface that was in contact with an underlying slab of material,
Okay.
and the other surface that was free. And they found that when they heated this film up, that the film would soften at a temperature that was lower than what it would do if it was a big chunk of material.
And when we're talking about a thin layer of this film, how thin are we talking about?
So this is a layer that's about 50 nanometers thick.
Okay.
So it's pretty thin. It's, in some cases, it's actually thinner than the polymer molecule itself wants to be. And so you end up squishing the molecules down, right, deforming them into this very, very thin layer. And because of that, they have different properties, interesting properties.
That's exciting, because I think you don't often think of a material as changing its physical characteristics and properties as proportionate to the size or amount of that material that you have, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the interesting aspect of nano, right? When you when you measure a sample that's macroscopic, right, it has certain properties. But when you shrink it down to the nanoscale, it can actually have properties that are significantly different from the bulk, and that's interesting.
Well, that's exciting. And so, I mean, you're the director, and I guess we're the co-founder of the Nanoscience program here at Guelph. That's correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so that came about sometime later after your initial work. So was that something that you sort of envisioned from the beginning, running or helping to institute this sort of multidisciplinary approach to physics and science in general? Or is this just something that naturally came out of the work you were doing?
It's something that just naturally arose. Basically, discussions between people in physics and chemistry, realizing that, with new technologies, new microscopes that allowed you to actually see atoms and molecules at the individual scale, that sort of prompts you to think about dedicating an effort bringing in aspects of physics, bringing in aspects of chemistry, biology, whatever, to study these very, very small systems. And so the nanoscience program was sort of a natural evolution of common research interests between people in physics and chemistry. And then we had an incoming dean who was interested in the program. So that's the other key aspect. You need to have an administrator.
Right place, right time again.
Yes. And so when we set up the program, the cornerstone of the program is really this amazing lab in which the nanoscience students get to use all of this fancy equipment just like you would find in research labs or in industry. And at a very early stage, starting in second year, they learn how to use these fancy microscopes and spectrometers and all kinds of interesting things. And then they become proficient at it and go on to do great things afterwards.
That's kind of interesting. It harkens back to the thing that we mentioned earlier, how, often our undergrads go through 4 years and still don't know how some basic things work or get to do with it. So putting them directly into the lab just 2 years in to work with this state-of-the-art material is a pretty exciting thing, I think, for young people coming into the physics or the nanoscience program here at Guelph.
It is, yeah. It's quite unique, I would say, that approach. And so our students have gone on to do great things in a large number of different areas, including various disciplines within engineering, material science, medicine.
Exciting. Yeah. Well, there's quite a bit more to your story that continues even with the development of your business, Mirexus. But I think we should probably go to our reporter in the field. I mean, it's been a lot of us just chatting here for the last 20 minutes. We should probably change this up a little bit with some different energy. And what's more different in energy in terms of bringing in Mel? So let's get Mel on the stream. How's it going there today, Mel? Are we having another classic moment where we can't hear her, or is she audible?
Hi, friends!
There we go. Well, Mel's back and it works. How are you doing there, Mel?
I'm good. How are you guys? This has been very interesting to sit in and listen to.
So do you have any questions from an undergraduate perspective that you'd like to talk to Dr. Nutcher about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes students look at research as being not so exciting. Like people envision sitting at a desk, maybe with a computer. And so I think I want to know, do you have a specific research day in your head that was the most exciting for you? And how does a research day look like for you and your students?
Right. That's a very good question, actually. It kind of makes me think way back to the beginning. All along the way, all along the path, there are exciting days, right? You discover new things and you figure out things that nobody has understood before. But from a personal perspective, I think that the most exciting day in research is when you get something to work for the first time, right? As a grad student, right? So the very first time that you try to build a very complicated experiment, for example, and it works, or you write this complicated computer code and it works, right? It's hard to compete with that level of excitement, I would say, like later on, even though maybe more significant things happen later on, it's that initial hook of figuring something out or getting something to work properly it has to be the most exciting day, I think.
It's funny, I think a lot of those milestones are what get us into physics or science in the first place. When you're a young person and you do an experiment or a science fair project, or you see a concept really out in front of you and it gets you excited about science and you're there. But yeah. I think, and I mean, even just speaking from personal experience, that it's easy to lose sight of the end goal while you're doing your studies and you're slogging through differential equation after differential equation and not necessarily seeing that there is excitement lying in your future. You're just working on building a bigger enough toolbox that you can work on these problems later on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, the big excitement was realizing that, I had done something that nobody had ever done before, right? That's the nature of doing research, right? You pick problems that are interesting, that haven't been solved before. And if you're fortunate and you work hard, you can make progress. And And, to have that as, the first time that somebody's seen this, or the first time that somebody's figured this out, that's priceless, I would say.
That's exciting. Well, we have Mel here, and I know that she's been very interested in this idea, as I can explain, because apparently she can. I'm just worried that your microphone's going to cut out. But no, there's an interest. We discussed earlier you're going from engineering to physics to even into business. Why don't we talk a little bit while Mel's here about the birth of Moraxis and about turning research into an actual physical business?
Sure. Yeah. Is there anything specific you would like to know, or should I just...
I think I want to know like how is it that you're in the lab, you make a discovery. How did you think to apply that to a business and make a business out of it, make cosmetics? How did that happen?
So it all started actually with a very fundamental basic research project. It was a project that I was doing together with Terry Beveridge's group in microbiology. So you had a microbiology group working with a physics group, and our goal was to try to figure out how bacteria stick to surfaces. Okay, so nothing to do with cosmetics or anything like that. So we just wanted to understand how that happened, right? And so the discovery itself was a classic case of serendipity, just happened by accident, which is true of a lot of great things in science, actually. In trying to figure out how bacteria stick to surfaces, it makes sense to look at the surface of the bacteria, right? And to look at the molecules that it has on its surface. And so to look at those in detail, you try to isolate them, right? So a certain type of molecule on the bacterial surface, it's called a lipopolysaccharide. The lipo part is embedded into the cell membrane on the bacterium, and the polysaccharide is the sugar polymer that sticks out from the surface. So when trying to isolate those molecules, there was sort of this complicated multi-step process. And one of those steps yielded a waste product that looked kind of cool. It had interesting optical properties, a property called opalescence, right? So different colors from different directions. So when the postdoc did this, it wasn't me that did it, but when the postdoc did this, he got this solution, this waste solution that looked kind of cool. So the key step here is that he did not throw it away. Right? And he said, oh, well, why don't we look at that later? Okay, so put it on a shelf, and then sometime later, we took this waste solution and dried a little bit of it down onto a very flat surface, looked at it with one of our fancy microscopes, and we saw to our amazement that it was all these little balls, nano-sized balls that were all very much the same size. And that was one of those kind of eureka moments in the lab, right, where no, it wasn't just garbage, which is what you might expect. It was something really interesting. And then the task was trying to figure out what it was, right? And so that was...
It's probably a unique thing to put that often when you're doing these processes, you get all types of waste or other particles that come off. But the fact that these were almost entirely monodisperse is really bizarre, isn't it?
It is. So you can look back and understand what you were seeing at the time, but at the time you don't know what you had.
Right.
But in retrospect, you can figure out what it was. So these little balls that were present in this waste solution were little tiny polymer, sugar polymers that were being produced by the bacteria as like little energy storage pills. So they were little balls of glucose all bonded together into this tight, compact little nanoparticle. And the reason why the bacterium was making it was basically for a rainy day. When it was running out of resources, it had these little energy pills that it could draw on for resources, right? And so we had really stressed out these bacteria in a big way. They were producing these little balls like crazy. And so we had enough to be able to measure them and then what's interesting about it is that coming at it from a physics perspective or a nanoscience perspective, you look at these little balls as a material. If you were, let's say, an agricultural chemist or something like that, right? Or a microbiologist, you would look at these from a biological perspective, right? And then you might use techniques that had been used previously to isolate similar kinds of molecules. And that's actually what happened in the past. People knew about these little balls, but they were not very careful when they extracted them. And so by doing an extraction that was fairly aggressive, they actually destroyed the special properties. But for us, coming from it from a materials perspective, it's like these little things are like little balls of gold or something. And so we want to treat them as delicately as possible, right? And by doing so, we were able to isolate and purify them without destroying their special properties and realizing that, oh, this really is something very significant.
It's interesting, I guess, at that point, you're just going through the purification process, looking at it. At this point, it's still not a business, right? You're just examining an interesting material.
Yes.
So what gives you the impetus to say, I bet you this has applications that could then take me to the business world?
So we were producing, I don't know, microgram quantities of this stuff, right? Very, very tiny quantities. So there is no business there, right? At that scale. So you have to think about scaling things up to think about having something that could potentially be a product in the marketplace. And so with bacteria, it doesn't work. We tried scaling up the production of these little balls with bacteria, and it was very, very difficult. They don't really cooperate, to be honest. However, we then realized that similar types of little energy balls were produced in sweet corn, and there's something that you can scale. So you can actually grow copious quantities of corn. It turns out that the inside the sweet kernels of corn that we have all eaten, there's a very, very large fraction of the corn kernel that's made up of these little tiny special balls. And so something that hadn't really fully been appreciated before. And then it becomes interesting because now you go from microgram quantities to the possibility of kilograms, tons, hundreds of tons.
Right. So the extraction process that you were using could be scaled up. It was just a lack of the materials in the first place.
Right. So we were fortunate enough. So scale up is a tricky business, right? As you find out when you try to do it. And so scale up of bacteria is really, really very difficult, actually, because of the way in which you have to mix the bacterial suspension so that you get them to produce the little balls, but you don't stress them too much so that they stop making them. With the corn, it's much more straightforward. The corn makes these naturally, and so we were able to determine or to come up with a procedure that only involved physical separation techniques, things like centrifugation and filtration, to isolate those little balls from everything else that was in the corn and come up with incredibly pure material that we could then use in different applications. Now, which applications you choose, that's sort of, that posed a big problem for us, actually, because you think about this little ball that you've got, and wow, it's a little nano-sized ball. It has special properties on its own, and you can also attach things to it, and it can serve as a carrier. And then you think, oh, wow, there's so many different things that these little particles can do. It's almost too many, actually. And so that is a real problem from the business perspective, because you cannot, in a business, do everything. You have to pick one thing and do it really well. And so that was really challenging for us because it could do everything.
So what is some of the everything? Like, what are the applications of these balls?
So You had mentioned their use in cosmetics, and that is the main market now for selling these products into the personal care industry. They have very interesting hydration properties, very interesting interaction with water. So when it absorbs water, it holds onto it quite strongly. So when you put these little hydrated balls into a personal care formulation, moisturizing lotion or something, then it provides what you might call a unique moisturizing agent. And so what that means in practice is that your skin feels really good, right? It doesn't get tight because there's sort of the slow release of moisture over long periods of time, right? So that's one application. But maybe the biggest holy grail of nanoscience is really drug delivery. And so you can think of this little ball as a carrier for an important bioactive compound. That might be a vitamin, it might be a drug, right? And you have this interesting possibility that the particle, the carrier particle itself, is completely natural, made up only of glucose, and which the body will break down with time. Okay, so instead of injecting silver nanoparticles into your body and turning blue like some people have done in the past,
let's just dismiss that possibility on
Here you have a particle that not only is it broken down and goes away, but when it does that, it provides food, right? So it's almost like the perfect drug delivery vehicle.
Wow.
Yeah, so that is an interesting aspect. And then when you modify it with different molecules, you can get very different biological effects, including both stimulating and downregulating the immune response of organisms. I mean, all kinds of wild stuff, actually.
So what was the timeline from the discovery of the little balls to finding the applications of them?
Right. So I would say that we identified a couple of wrong applications right away. And then you sort of get a reality check. So I guess the university had published a news story about these little balls that we had discovered. And we were then contacted by a paint company who was interested in making environmentally friendly paint.
Oh, wow.
That's a nice idea, but completely impractical from an economic perspective. It's just too expensive. But so we went along that line for a while and then realized, oh yeah, this doesn't actually make much sense. But paint for your face, that's much better, right? So cosmetics, where you only need a little bit and you can charge a lot of money for it, then it becomes more sensible, right?
More of a business, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so what makes a good business? Like going from being a physicist to a businessman, what have you learned in that transition?
Well, I would say up front that I am not a businessman. I have started a business. I have started a company which has evolved into a business. A business is not the same as a company. Anyone can start a company, but a business is something that can actually generate revenue.
Yeah.
And that's very different from most companies that are startups out of universities. So it was a long, tortuous path, actually. We had a great science team. We had, it was myself and 3 postdocs from physics, microbiology, and biochemistry. So we had all the science covered. We were studying this material, finding out all kinds of wonderful properties, but we really didn't know much about business at all. And so we were really hobbled by that, because one of the things you need to do in business is to raise money, to do what you need to do to bring that product to the marketplace. And so you find out after talking to investor groups that they almost just take it as a given that the science is fine. Came out of a university, must be fine. But then, yeah, which is not a good assumption. But the thing that was really holding us back was our team. We had a great science team, but no business person. And so that was a huge problem. So what happens in a lot of science startups is that they fail at that point because the scientists, well, first of all, they think they can do everything, which is not true. The business side is, in fact, a very different set of skills that complements the technical side. And so the first step for a scientist is to appreciate what that brings to the table and what the business people, a good business person, can do that they are not capable of doing. And that is a big realization that, if this is your little baby, right? And then you want to bring in somebody who's going to, who, maybe doesn't fully understand it and might try to do things with it that you're not comfortable. There are all kinds of scenarios that prevent scientists from engaging with business people. But if you want to be successful, you need to break down that barrier and bring in, once again, learning from, another discipline, in this case, business. And in our case, we were very fortunate to hire what I would call a business scientist, really. So Phil had spent his entire career, he got his PhD in chemistry from McGill, and then spent his entire career in industry, both small and large. And then we could see when we met with him that he immediately got the science and then was thinking about the business opportunities. And so that combination was perfect for us, actually, because it was such a science-heavy innovation. It was important to have a business person that could, fully appreciate the technical properties and think about how to, use those to do something that could be a product in the marketplace.
It's an interesting thing because the common trend I'm seeing in everything that you've been doing so far is going into a field and looking for mentorship and seeking those people around you to learn from, and also admitting that you don't always have the answers right there.
Yeah.
So a lot of what you're saying is to go in and to question things. And at this point, I'd like to propel from that incredible segue to mention that we do have a live Q&A going on our stream right now. And if you do have questions for Dr. Dutcher that you'd actually like to ask, we can bring a few of those in. I know there's been a few that have come up already in the chat, and we've actually organically kind of gotten to them already. I'll start out with one that I have, which I think is interesting. Having worked with you in the past, I think you're really a skilled and gifted leader, especially for your students. And you've always had these very large research groups that you work with. Do you find that leadership role just kind of came to you? Was it something that you worked on? And is it dramatically different going from leading a group of scientists to leading a group in business?
Well, first of all, thank you very much.
I did drop out, but at the same time.
I never really took any formal training in leadership, but I was, once again, very receptive to learning about effective approach leadership, and I was able, through various interactions, to see what worked well and what did not work well at all, which is a very valuable lesson as well. And then you need to have the ability to adapt to that and to say, oh, okay, so I would like to, run my group this way. And I really think of myself as a facilitator, really, for my students, right? They're the ones, unfortunately, I don't get a chance to spend time in the lab anymore. And so I live vicariously through my students. And so the best thing that I can do is to give them all the resources, all of the expertise, all of the equipment that they need to do what they need to do, right? And then to develop their skills in explaining what they've done and, telling the world about it. And so, yeah, it's basically just, being a good facilitator, I would say, and trying to mentor them as well, right?
Well, we have a question coming in from breaking news. We have a question coming in from an Ethan Watt, and they want to know, how different is industrial research and development as compared to experimental research?
Okay. I remember Ethan. Hi, Ethan. It's good to hear from you. I would say that, a general strategy that you develop doing, let's say, grad work in a lab is something that will serve you well in industry. You will work on different projects, different types of projects, but it's that, I guess, approach that you learn, I guess, mostly in an academic setting. How to do research is almost universal, right? You have to ask good questions. You have to use good techniques. You have to know what people have done before you. You have to be able to critically evaluate your results and the results of others, right? These are all very useful techniques for succeeding both in academic research as well as in industry. And so there are different problems, but the same strategies are easily applied. That being said, maybe the time scale is a bit different in an industrial setting. There may be more urgency, right, than just allowing you to tinker in the lab for a couple of years in an academic setting. And so, what was the question? It was basically comparing industrial and academic research, was it?
Yep.
Yeah. So I would say that the tools that you learn in the academic setting are immediately translatable to the industrial setting, but there may be other requirements that you need to meet to succeed in the industrial setting, like the ability to deliver in a very timely fashion and all of that. So.
I noticed that we discussed the timeline of your achievements and of the different changes to the way you do research and whatnot. I noticed that the time between 1999 and 2004 didn't really come up. Now, is it because I was an incredible burden in the lab, or because I was taking up so much of the sort of, was really the star of the entire thing? For those of you who don't know, John was my supervisor through those years, where I got to do quite a bit of exciting research in the lab when we were working with what would later actually go on to be called Dutcher films in the literature, which is kind of an incredible thing. Did you ever think that you'd be eponymous to the naming of the actual stuff you were studying?
No, not at all. It came about actually after giving a talk at a conference. I went to what's called a Gordon conference, which is a small group of experts in a particular field. And I gave this talk about these polymer tri-layer films, 3 layers of polymer, where the middle layer is soft and the 2 outer layers are stiffer.
I think we called them Orbax films back then.
And, when you heat them up, you get interesting patterns that form. And so, I gave my lecture on this, and afterwards, a theorist from England came up to me and was asking me about all of this and was very excited. And we must have talked for a couple of hours, and then didn't hear from him. And then the following year, I got a message from one of my former grad students who had noticed this paper in which it had used the term Dutcher films in the title, right? And this was this guy's paper. He had taken my lecture and our discussion and done some wonderful computer simulations of these structures and found, new things. So that was pretty cool.
That's really fun. Well, somehow we've been able to maintain this conversation. We're at 51 minutes here already. So we should probably start moving towards wrapping up. John, is there anything that you wanted to touch on subject-wise before we give Mel a final chance to ask some questions?
Yeah, I guess we've covered a lot of the different aspects that I thought that we might. This idea of opening your eyes, being curious, right? In the lab, that's one thing I look for in my grad students is, are they curious? Do they want to understand something? A lot of people can get a result in the lab, but what does that mean? And where does that lead you, right? That's where interesting things happen. And especially if you bring in aspects of different disciplines to a problem. I mean, if you're studying things like biophysics and soft matter physics, nature doesn't really know about all of the artificial disciplines that we set up. Chemistry, physics, biology, math. Oh, this is a math system. Okay, great. No, it's just got a system that's super interesting and very complicated. And so it's our job to bring to bear everything that we can to try to understand that system in nature. And sometimes you can figure it out just with physics or chemistry or biology. But typically, you need aspects of all of those. And so that's really the realization that I've come to in my career. And to have, a respect for what the other disciplines can bring to the table. I mean, we bring a lot as physicists, right? We've got, great techniques that we've developed that nobody else could do. And, we like math. Right? So we can develop simple mathematical models that can explain things without being too complicated. Those are really valuable deliverables, right, in any kind of collaboration, right? But, the biologists and the chemists and the engineers bring in other aspects that are, perhaps equally as valuable. And so to appreciate that and to embrace that, I think, is really important. And that's something that I always tell the nanoscience students, because they're in a program that's inherently multidisciplinary, right? And it's really, I would say, at the interface between disciplines that really cool things can happen.
It's a classic metaphor for your career, looking at interfaces and seeing what interesting things occur there.
That's right.
Well, Mel, did you have any final questions?
Yeah, I think a nice way to conclude this would be to ask, what advice do you have for high school students that might be considering education in physics?
So do you mean what opportunities are there for them after?
Yeah, do you have any advice on what they should do to succeed? What careers they can go into, that kind of stuff, yeah.
Yeah, so I think, somebody going into physics, I think, has to be naturally curious. They have to want to understand how things work, right? That should be the motivation for doing that. What they may not realize is that there are opportunities that result because of that, right? The ability to problem solve, right, is sadly not very common. And so physicists, for example, have gone on not only to do physics, but also to do great things in politics and business and whatever, just because they have this ability to get to the crux of the matter and to actually crunch through a problem, right, and figure it out. And that is a really valuable skill set that is perhaps underappreciated. So I think that's what you would get out of a physics education. That, to me anyway. There's a whole lot of other stuff along the way, but you build up your toolbox so that you can do specific things. But in general terms, the idea of being able to tackle, have this confidence, maybe an unfounded confidence that you can solve any problem. It's not a bad thing, actually. So what if you can't? But maybe you can. You find, when you start looking at different areas like chemistry or biology, and you're talking to people, you end up asking kind of silly or maybe even stupid questions, right? But sometimes you ask questions that make them think, oh, well, never thought of it that way before. And maybe out of that comes, some additional new insight. So anyway, all of those opportunities exist, I would say, with a physics degree. It's just a question of, embracing that and putting it into practice.
So physics is a nice stepping stone, basically.
It is, yeah.
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 Well, it's funny, you know, one of the things that I think I learned from my undergraduate degree in physics was that doing a physics degree kind of didn't matter how well you did or what the numbers were on your grades, but it was that you engaged with the process and you learned how to learn and how to keep searching and trying to find stuff. And I think, you know, it's funny to speak to what John was saying about sometimes this unbacked confidence.
Yes.
You can spend your whole life wondering how things occur or trying to figure things out, but without actually attempting to do them, then you'll never get a chance to do. And I think that's one of the things that physics brings to the table is a bunch of people who are willing to just get in there and figure out how things are happening and learn more and keep learning.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we're getting close to the end. We've got another, John. This one comes from a Joshua Mogioros. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Former student of mine as well, who is saying, says, hello, Dr. Dutcher. Now that you're maintaining a goatee, would you consider curling your mustache? That's okay. We can dismiss that one right out if we need to. It's just Josh.
I could never compete with you, Orbex.
Well, that's nice to hear, and I guess not a better way to close. So stick around, John. I think this was a good practice version, so I guess we'll start the real stream in about 5 minutes. But no, I'd just like to thank everybody tonight who's joined us in the live stream. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're going to try to make this regular programming, especially now within the context of how we can actually interact with our students and with our faculty. So there'll be more of this coming up. If you're looking and you're interested and you aren't already following us on our various social media profiles, you can find us at Guelph Physics on Facebook, at FIGU on Instagram, or at FIGU on YouTube as well. So subscribe, like, and just give us a follow, and you'll be able to see when programming like this is coming up, and hopefully you'll stick with us and we'll get to see some interesting things. So I just want to thank everybody tonight, especially Dr. John Dutcher. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Mel, for being here. And I also like to give a big round of applause and a special thank you to behind the board, Saksham Sharma, who is sitting there and making sure everything's actually running. So fantastic work tonight, everybody, and good work, team. So thank you very much for joining us, everybody, and end communication.
Thanks so much.